What? Why are you shaking your head?
You're welcome.
Hey guys, and welcome to the Week 9 edition of the Fantasy Points UFL Breakdown. I'm your host, Jake Tribby. I couldn't be happier to be back for Week 9, and I'm joined by my co-host, Millionaire Maker winner, and one of the greatest spring football DFS players ever, Neil Orfield. Neil, how's it going this week?
It is going well. I'm excited to get back into it after another rough week for me last week. As somebody who likes to poke holes in the chalk and like tries to get away from it, I was really bought into both Jacob Sailors and John Lovett last week. That was brutal. Watching both of them give up their starter role seemed like that was not unexpected for me last week. So excited to get back into it this week.
Yeah, last week was really weird. I played a ton of West Hills. Obviously, that went about as badly as possible. I also just hammered the over on, 26.5 was such a terrible line, and ESPN got away with it. It's ridiculous. The John Lovett stuff was weird too. I think, we certainly anticipated McFarland to get in there on passing downs and all that. But Lovett was losing early down work to Morgan Ellison. Especially inside the 5. I think he lost an inside the 5 carry to Ellison. It was very, very strange usage there. And then Jacob Sailors, I think probably would have ended up with a pretty good score, but he got hurt on his first touch in the second half. Ended up coming out. Yeah. He came out immediately, and then he sort of came back in, I believe, beginning of the fourth quarter, took one carry, didn't look very good, and then immediately signaled to come out. So we'll talk about all that later on. But Neil, anything else you wanted to cover before we get into these games?
No, it's super weird now with all of the like split quarterback rooms. Like it's getting to the point where it's like you kind of just need to play the guys who are going to play, who we expect to play most of the game at this point. So we have fewer options than we have had in some past weeks. But it's, it'll be fun talking about figuring out what we want to do here.
Yeah, I think this week, and especially week 10, should be the weeks, probably excluding week 1, with the biggest edge of the season, because we're going to have, teams resting players, probably a lot of, coach speak to take into account here. And obviously, everybody's hurt at this point. So a lot of stuff to take into account, but thankfully we do that all for you guys over at Fantasy Points. We've got a UFL DFS product this season. You get player projections, main slate ownership projections, an exclusive UFL DFS Discord channel where you can ask me, Neil, Chris Wecht, Johnny Proctor questions about the slate, access to my UFL articles, which will be behind the paywall every other week. This week's is free, so definitely go check that out. We've also slashed the sticker price of our UFL product down to $40 for the rest of the season, and promo code UFL 2024 gets you an additional 15% off on top of it. That promo code also works for all access for 15% off, by the way. So if you use promo code UFL 2024, that brings your per week cost down to $8.50 per week for the remainder of the season. This is your last chance to get the UFL plan this cheap. So sign up now if you haven't already. And you can get even more value from our UFL product if you have access to ESPN Bet, because they're listing UFL player props. Like I say every week, the menu is surprisingly deep. They've added touchdowns. There are a ton of bets here. There are generally some pretty big discrepancies between these props and our player projections, which makes for a great betting opportunity. I've already posted about a dozen bets that I grabbed in our paywalled UFL DFS channel. The lines are pretty soft yet again, and we've been killing it on props this year. We're 15, 7, and 1 for a plus 36% ROI. If you exclude Jacob Sailors and Wes Hills, who didn't get there last week because of injury, that ROI would be significantly higher. But yeah, definitely go check that out, guys, if you haven't already, over at fantasypoints.com. But let's get into these games. First game this week kicks off at noon Eastern on Saturday. It's the St. Louis Battlehawks at the Arlington Renegades. St. Louis is favored by 3. Total here is 46. I think you could make an argument that St. Louis should be favored by a little bit more here. I have seen a few 2.5s out there. I've thought about grabbing those. The total seems about right. Neil, do you have any takes on this game line?
Yeah, I think that you are correct. I think that there should be a little bit of a larger spread here. I feel like 46 feels about right to me. I guess if I were going to take anything, it would be St. Louis with the points. But I feel like the lines have gotten so much better recently. It's tough to nitpick these days, because I think that they're just getting better at pricing these teams.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. We haven't had many official plays on the Discord over the last month because the lines have been pretty sharp here. I think really, to me, this matchup may come down to the fact that St. Louis's biggest strength right now is their passing defense. Arlington, if their passing offense isn't really clicking, they just can't seem to move the ball. So that does make me side with St. Louis. I don't think the spread is quite high enough. Injuries here on the St. Louis side. AJ McCarron is still rehabbing his ankle injury, but he's going to be active and he will be the backup quarterback this week. So Manny Wilkins will be making his second consecutive start. Jamarcus Bradley is out with a neck issue. Ja'Cour Pearson, who's dealing with an ankle, and Marcel Aitman, who's dealing with COVID, are both back in the lineup after full Thursday practices. Pearson is listed as a starter, and Aitman is actually listed as Pearson's backup, but I'm not sure that means much. On the Arlington side, Letty Brown will miss his second consecutive game. Lindsey Scott is also the QB3 this week. Holton Ahlers will back up Luis Perez. Before we get into the St. Louis side, I just want to take a second to say that this is pretty weird. Obviously, Arlington's completely out of the playoff race. I was really hoping we would get a full game from Lindsey Scott at some point because I think he could basically be like mini Adrian Martinez out there. I mean, he could be just an absolute monster if he got a full game, at least for fantasy purposes. But it's going to be Holton Ahlers. We'll see what they do in week 10. Maybe we get, a weird Lindsey Scott, Holton Ahlers split, but at least for now, we're sort of just anticipating probably 95% of these passing dropbacks go to Luis Perez with Ahlers. I mean, Ahlers can run a little bit, so they may just give him the Lindsey Scott role. I'm not exactly sure what they want to do. I think, both of these backup quarterbacks may just get more time in week 10. But all right, starting with the St. Louis side here, anybody who watched the game last week would note that Manny Wilkins didn't really look like a quarterback as much as he did a running back playing quarterback last week, which is obviously great for him scoring fantasy points. Really not great for any of these other St. Louis pass catchers scoring fantasy points. 25% of Manny Wilkins dropbacks ended up becoming scrambles last week. That's an absolutely massive number. He only attempted 18 passes, and I believe only 5 of those traveled more than 10 air yards. So to me, it really seemed like Manny Wilkins, if he wasn't, throwing immediately to a quick first read, he was just looking to run. And that certainly makes this tough for fantasy. I mean, you look through our St. Louis wide receiver projections. These guys all have very, very low numbers. Hakeem Butler still okay here, but I mean, it's really tough with how spread out they've been. And then, also with this whole Manny Wilkins thing, I mean, there won't be many targets to go around here. So Neil, I'm kind of curious, what are your thoughts on Wilkins? And I'm assuming, double stacks are completely off the table. Do you even want to stack him with anyone besides Hakeem Butler?
I still think I do. I think generally I am still pro stacking. I know these contests are a little bit smaller. He's not super expensive, so you might be able to get away without stacking him in a contest this size. I still think that I generally am just inclined to stack, try and get fewer things that I have to get right. So I'm probably still going to be stacking Manny Wilkins. We just had a question in chat. Favorite quarterback for a single entry if you're concerned about Martinez not playing the whole game. I do think that Manny Wilkins is the right answer there, largely because they are playing Arlington. Arlington has given up over the past 3 weeks 251 pass yards per game. That is the second worst after Memphis. The Showboats giving up 288 pass yards per game over the past 3 weeks. But Arlington is the second worst defense against the pass over the past few weeks. Also give up plenty on the ground. So I do really like the spot for Manny Wilkins. I am generally going to be single stack, and I think that you're correct. Like I don't feel the need to force the double stack here because he is going to do so much on the ground and because he is so cheap. But I think you can go to, obviously Hakeem Butler is the clearest there. I'll still do probably some Ja'Cour Pearson, even though, the projections come down a little bit. I still think he's, as you said, he's listed as a starter. They've had weeks where they target him 9-10 games. So I do kind of think he's still there. I'm debating how many lineups it would have to be before I play my guy, Marcel Aitman, let me down once again. Probably be 10, probably if I play 10 lineups, I might play a share of Marcel Aitman. It does spook me a little bit that he's not listed as the starter. That is, I already was starting to be concerned just with the okay, he's been sick, but is that the real reason, or are they just he hasn't really done anything, or are they kind of oh, you're a little bit sick, why don't you sit this one out kind of thing? Are they going away from him anyway? Kind of hard to read the situation. But the fact that he's listed as the backup does concern me a little bit. So I still think that I would take shots on Marcel Aitman if I'm playing 10 plus lineups. But there's a real chance for a 0 there now that he is listed as the backup, hasn't really done anything. So primarily it would be Butler and Pearson for me. You could consider, Darius Shepard, second on the team in routes run last week. He's 6,500. I don't know. It doesn't feel as good as it felt a few weeks ago when we really just had a few guys getting all of the playing all the snaps and getting all the targets. Butler clearly is probably not playing anybody except for Butler in a small field. Only in the largest field, I would start to consider Ja'Cour Pearson, Darius Shepard, maybe Marcel Aitman.
Yeah. So to me, I think I'm just going to cut it off after Ja'Cour Pearson. I think Pearson, we obviously know a lot of scheme throws are going to go to Hakeem Butler. That's really not up for debate. Pearson is clearly next on the totem pole in terms of, quick design throws, either screens or like quick slants, RPO, where he's the, clear first read. And then after that, it gets pretty vague between Shepard and Aitman. I'm Aitman being listed as the backup, I really don't think matters much. What does concern me is that they've said for a couple weeks now that because of COVID, his conditioning hasn't been great. So I think reduced snaps because of that is a much higher risk than inferring based on the depth chart here. And for what it's worth, we will talk about this in the next game, but also to help answer Sam Pierce's question, I do think Adrian Martinez will end up playing the whole game. We'll get into the reasons when we talk about the Birmingham game up here next. But yeah, for me, if I'm stacking Manny Wilkins, I mean, it's starting with Hakeem Butler, and then I'll do a little bit of Ja'Cour Pearson. I won't play as many teams as I usually do this week, probably going mostly hand builds. But yeah, I just really don't see myself getting to Darius Shepard or Aitman. I do think you can justify Shepard because he will be out there for every route. But I mean, we saw Shepard out there for every route last week. Stephen Mitchell was out there for every route last week. Jamarcus Bradley had his route share in the 40 or 50 percentile range, and they all zeroed, which is just absolutely brutal when you have a quarterback who's just pretty much exclusively looking to run. The backfield, I think, is pretty interesting. Obviously, we want to play Jacob Sailors. I'm not too worried about a role reduction here. I think if you extrapolate a bit too much from last game, didn't know he was, injured for the second half, you might be a little bit more worried about that. I think you could make an argument that Wayne Gallman actually looked pretty good, so they may just want to give him a little bit more work. But yeah, Neil, I'll throw it over to you. Any thoughts on this St. Louis backfield? To me, I feel fairly neutral about Jacob Sailors given his projection, his ownership here. I also worry a little bit for either running back, and I have actually bet both of these guys touchdown props on ESPN Bet. But I worry that, any sort of RPO style play near the goal line, Manny Wilkins is just going to pull it. Like, he really wants to run the ball. His 12 carries last week was the most by any quarterback all season. So that is a little concerning for this ground game, but still, Arlington's a pretty bad defense here.
Yeah, it is. It's an interesting spot because you're right. Like, we definitely risk giving up those goal line carries, those red zone carries to the quarterback. They did, at least they had 19 runs from the backfield last week. So that gives me some hope that, maybe they don't fully buy into Manny Wilkins as a quarterback. Like, he's just not the same level as AJ McCarron. So maybe they do lean into the run a little bit more, continue to keep these guys very involved. So yeah, I think, Sailors at 9,800, 20% projected ownership. If we can give him 15 of those carries, which maybe that's a little bit more than we can, hope for. And I think we can hope for. I think that it's a reasonable number. Yeah, I think that the ownership feels about right at 20%. I'm not going to be jamming him like I did last week. But it is a nice spot here. The price is, fine for what he was prior to last week. If we assume he's going to get back to something close to the role he had in the previous weeks, I think that 9,800 is a perfectly fair price, and particularly in this matchup. But it is a great matchup. So yeah, I think 20% probably about right.
Yeah. Do you have any strong takes on pairing him with Manny Wilkins? I think it's fine. It's probably a slight negative correlation there, but I wouldn't. It's not something I'm gonna like blanket avoid or anything like that.
Yeah, I'm exact same. I'm not going to be not playing it at all. It's not something that I'm targeting. Like, I really want to do that stack, but I think they can both get there in their own way. So not taking any huge stand there. I do want to say, I think you may have talked me off of Marcel Aitman. I had not heard the concerns about his conditioning with COVID, but that does make sense that they would list him as the backup. That makes me kind of think, okay, maybe they will just play him limited snaps. And part of the reason I was playing him previously was that he was an every down kind of player. So I think it might be if you're 150 maxing, maybe you take a couple shots, but I'm not, or you can't even 150. If you're maxing the contest, I'm not planning on maxing the contest. So probably not playing him.
Yeah, it's St. Louis is very self-aware in terms of how deep they are at wide receiver. So I think that's sort of another knock against Aitman is if they don't think his conditioning's, not all the way there, they're not going to force it. There's just no
Exactly.
chance.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's certainly tough, but it's easy to see St. Louis putting up a ton of points here. It's just most likely going to happen on the ground. So I think the furthest I'd go, I mean, generally when I think a team could score a lot of points, I'm more than fine, double stacking the quarterback, even triple stacking, throwing a running back in there. I think this week for St. Louis, I'd rather play, Manny Wilkins, Sailors, maybe Butler, Pearson, and then like the St. Louis defense is about as far as I'd go with my St. Louis stacks here.
Yeah.
All right. We've got next up here, we've got the Arlington Renegades. With Luis Perez at quarterback, it's just kind of the same old story, right? Where, these doubles and triples look pretty good as contrarian options. But I think, the toughest part, at least with this week, is that St. Louis is by far the best pass defense in the UFL. So we've got Perez's ownership has been a little tricky for me. He's, projecting well enough for him to pull 8-10%. I'm not sure many people are going to go that way because I think the narrative that St. Louis's pass defense is very good. One, I mean, it's largely true. But two, I think that may steer people away from Perez a bit, which does make him a little bit more tempting here in tournaments. Obviously, Sal Cannella has been tearing it up the last few weeks. Over the last 2 games, leads all players in both receiving fantasy points per game and targets. So he's going to be quite popular. Javonte Payton, Tyler Vaughn's both going to be pretty popular. Deontay Burnett out there for every single route last week, not getting you anywhere. He hasn't scored more than double-digit DraftKings points in about a month. But, we're only projecting him for 6% ownership. So, Neil, is this just another sort of mix and match situation with Luis Perez stacks, or what direction do you want to go here?
Yeah, I think it pretty much is. As I said, we have limited options as far as quarterbacks that are going to be playing most of the snaps. Luis Perez, our fourth best projected quarterback at just 14.9 fantasy points. So we're not expecting a lot, but we are expecting him to play most of the game. The thing that you like about Luis Perez is just the really condensed target tree. We really have, as you said, four receiving options that we can really consider with Luis Perez in Tyler Vaughn, Sal Cannella, JP Payton, and Deontay Burnett. I keep on going back to Burnett. The most frustrating thing about this UFL season has been players, I don't see their role changing. I just see their ownership changing. And then as soon as the ownership changes, they go off. And that's been the Sal Cannella story. Just like all of a sudden everybody's playing him and he's just going off every single week. But he is up to 7,900 now. Deontay Burnett down to 5,800 and 6% ownership. This is a spot where I'm probably not going to be playing much more than the field of Louis. We have him at 8% ownership. That feels about right for Luis Perez. I really like the 3 quarterbacks that we have projected better than Luis Perez because of the matchup mostly. But I don't see myself, I think I'll be right there with the field. I think Luis Perez there are things that you like about it, it being that he is going to play most of the snaps and he has a really condensed target tree. I think I would be inclined in those stacks. Again, I'm going to go back to Deontay Burnett. Hasn't been working out at all. Maybe it's just not going to work out for us, but he is the guy that is the cheapest and the lowest owned. And like you said, he's out there for every snap. We've seen him, have little spurts. Really only once we saw it. Like there was like a couple minutes at the end of a game where they just went to him, peppered him with targets. But I guess I just still have that dream that that's going to happen again in one of these games at low ownership and maybe gets a touchdown out of it. So I like Deontay Burnett at ownership. Sal Cannella's ownership to me is just, I can't get there. I'm going to be lower than the field for sure. Now he's up to 29% ownership and 7,900. Takes a lot more for him to get there. It's a tough matchup. So I think I'm going to be pretty significantly under the field on Sal Cannella. And I'll take my shots on Tyler Vaughn's JP Payton. I feel like the ownership is about right. 20% going to Payton, 13% Vaughn's. I'll probably not be too far from the field there.
Yeah, I feel pretty similarly. I think underweight Cannella makes a lot of sense. I mean, he's projecting pretty well everywhere. I could see him coming in even higher than the 28% we have projected. So, that's certainly tough. I mean, not a bad play, but it's just tough chasing this kind of volume. I mean, the 2 best games of Sal Cannella's career have come in the last 2 weeks. Is that something we really want to chase? For me personally, I mean, I'm not going to full fade him, but it does make me pretty uneasy here. Had a question in chat about Gallman or Sailors. I would definitely lean towards Sailors. Gallman's pretty expensive, so it doesn't project particularly well, point per dollar. I think Gallman's probably more tempting in Showdown, but I mean, I guess you could make an argument for Gallman on main slate, just with the idea that, hey, we've seen St. Louis mix up, who's the bell cow, early in the season. And then they sort of settled on Jacob Sailors. Sailors didn't show up on the injury report. He did get hurt last week. Gallman looked good. So there could be some narrative reasons to play Gallman, but I think it's pretty clearly Sailors and most builds. Anything to add there, Neil?
Nope. I think that you nailed it.
All right. So we covered this Arlington passing attack, and this running game is really interesting to me. Davion Smith has moved into a pretty great role. He leads all running backs in snap share, 86%, 79% route share. That's also first, 13.3 weighted opportunities per game, which ranks fifth over the last 2 weeks. So he's, full-blown bell cow. The only problem is that Arlington goes extremely pass-heavy when they fall behind. Granted, the spread here is only 3, so I'm not sure that Arlington is going to get behind enough to warrant, totally abandoning the run and getting away from Davion Smith. At the very least, we're looking at, worst case, probably a Darius Victor type situation where he's out there for every route or every snap and just isn't really doing much. That said, I could definitely see a scenario here where Arlington gets an early lead and all of a sudden Davion Smith is at the very top of week 9 weighted opportunity. There are a lot of decent running back options. No one I'm really in love with this week. So Neil, I'm curious what you think about Davion Smith.
Yeah, I mean, I see this much ownership, 28% going to Davion Smith at 7,600. And to me, it's just like, I don't want to play that at all. I will say St. Louis giving up over 100 rushing yards per game over the past 3 weeks. So a little bit more susceptible on the ground than they are through the air. So maybe theoretically you could get there, but man, I don't think I can do it at that ownership for that price for Davion Smith. Like he is, I think he broke the 100-yard barrier recently. I don't think we're going to see him break the 100-yard barrier again this season or in his career. I just don't think that he doesn't put up those big chunk plays. He had one where he broke a tackle and somehow just like trudged his way to like, I want to say like a 40-yarder a couple weeks ago, but that is just not really what you expect from Davion Smith, even with this role at this price tag and this ownership. I think it's mostly a stay away from me. I would be surprised if I get to even half the field on Davion Smith.
Yeah, I definitely understand those concerns that maybe I might walk his ownership back a few points because I think a lot of people, I mean, it's like the weeks where Darius Victor was projecting for massive ownership. I think a lot of people just see that number and they say, I'm not going to play a hyper inefficient running back at this kind of ownership when he could easily be game scripted out. To me, I think the way you want to play Davion is with the Arlington defense. I think that's probably the best way to do it. You need a bit of a slower sort of grinded out style game where Arlington is, at worst down no more than 7 or 8 points so that they stick with the ground game there. I really don't think, whether it's, or I guess it will be Devin Darrington because we know Letty Brown is out. Just not really interested in there. I think they've pretty much settled in on Davion Smith as their bell cow. Anything to add, Neil, before we move on here?
No, I think you nailed it. I am trying to, as we're talking through the next days, I guess I'm going to have to look through the other running backs a little bit closer because I just look at him in a vacuum and I'm like, I definitely don't want to play it. But sometimes, a couple weeks ago, I said the same thing. And then when it came down to it, it was like, oh, there's 0 other running backs in this range that I want to play. So I ended up playing a few shares. So maybe I'll end up with some. But at that price, I would imagine I'm going to be less than half the field on Davion Smith. But well, as we talk through the other games, maybe I'll change my stance there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of good but not great plays at running back. Yeah. I think Ricky Person, Colburn, McFarlane, Davion, Jacob Sailors. They're all good, but you can poke holes in all these guys.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the that's sort of the tricky part. But all right, here we can move on to our second game on Saturday. It kicks off at 3 p.m. Eastern time. It's the Birmingham Stallions at the San Antonio Brahmas. Birmingham's favored by 8.5 here. Total is 44. I think this line is just about right. Neil, do you have any takes on it?
No, I agree. Line feels about right. Obviously, I'll back my Brahmas, take the 8.5 points, but I don't feel that strongly about it. Birmingham is just so good. It's really tough to want to really make a hard bet there. But I'll take the points with the Brahmas on when it's 8.5.
Yeah, I guess if I had to, I would, you can't fade our Brahmas, but man, it is tough when the line looks this sharp. On the injury front, Birmingham is clean. It's been remarkable how good Birmingham has been this year, obviously, but they've also been incredibly injury free. It's just been ridiculous. Yeah. They've been crazy healthy this season. So yeah, they're totally clean, but CJ Maribel is back as the RB2. Larry Roundtree will be inactive. On the San Antonio side, we got some big news yesterday. John Lovett is out due to a chest injury he suffered in practice. Chase Garbers will be Dormady's backup this week. We expect Garbers to start in the playoffs. He could get a start in week 10, depending on if that game matters for San Antonio or not. But at least for this week, he will be Dormady's backup. From what I heard Wednesdays with Wade Phillips, still expressed plenty of confidence in Dormady. So you could argue the benching risk is higher with Garbers back, but I think they want to save Garbers for some of these more important games down the stretch. So I would imagine it'll be Dormady for, the entirety of this game, unless there's a true disaster here with him. But starting with the Birmingham Stallions side of the ball, we have Adrian Martinez, who I know a lot of people have brought up the potential benching risks here. And really, I don't think those risks are significant much at all. Last year, Birmingham had playoff positioning locked up in week 10, which is an even more meaningless game than what they're playing right now. And they played team MVP and USFL MVP Alex Magoo for the entirety of that game. He got all 57 snaps in a completely meaningless game. I think going 10-0 matters to them. I think getting Adrian Martinez the MVP also matters to them. So, that's sort of where I fall on Adrian Martinez. I think he's going to play the whole game. I think he's, if you're playing single entry, anything like that, it largely starts and ends with a guy like Adrian Martinez. Of course, you could argue for Manny Wilkins, Jordan Teamu. But yeah, Neil, I'm curious, how are you going to handle the likely mega chalky Adrian Martinez, who, despite having his price raised to 11,500, is still probably 2,500 too cheap. And yeah, receivers are, a little tricky as always here.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll say the downside, if you're trying to poke holes in Adrian Martinez, is San Antonio only giving up 249 total yards per game over the past 3 weeks. That is the fewest yards per game of any team. 161 pass yards per game, the second least giving up through the air. So a lot of, it is a tough spot for Adrian Martinez, but I do think that he is so good that it's really hard. And we have so few options that we expect to play the whole game. It's really hard to not want to just play a ton of Adrian Martinez. Projects 4 points better than the next best projected player out there. He is also 11,500. So there is that with Adrian Martinez. The price tag is way higher than any other starting quarterback here. Honestly, not taking a huge stand here. I'm probably going to be right with the field. I might be slightly underweight to the field on Adrian Martinez just because I really want to take some shots on Manny Wilkins and Jordan Teamu. So just because I really like those two, I think that I might come in slightly underweight to the field on Adrian Martinez just to boost those guys up. But he's been so good. It's really hard to fade him. He's one of those guys that, I said it last week. It was like, I go back and forth between just like, do I just play this guy in all of my lineups, or and I always come back to, I end up fading him because I just hate playing super chalky players that much. But I kind of think it's not the wrong move to just play Adrian Martinez and call it a day. Like, he's just been so consistently good. Like, even if one of these guys, matches him, and they are cheaper, like that helps a lot. But also, you can get away with it even if they do match him. He's just, he's got a really, really high floor, which is floor in XF or in UFL matters more than it does like in the NFL, I would say. So yeah, I do like Adrian Martinez quite a bit. I'm curious, just having the MVP debate. I know this is sort of an aside. Is there anybody else in contention for MVP? Like, I'm just trying to think who else would even be.
Yeah,
considered.
I was kind of wondering the exact same thing. I don't know if they need to do anything else to get Adrian Martinez the MVP. Honestly, I'm not even sure if you'd be looking at other quarterbacks at this point. McCarron getting hurt kind of derailed his potential MVP campaign, and he hasn't looked unstoppable like Martinez has.
Right.
Man, I mean, maybe you could give it to a running back or a wide receiver. Yeah, Hakeem Butler, maybe. You could have argued for John Lovett if he didn't get benched and then hurt.
Yeah, but the team's undefeated, and he's just been so good. Like, I think he's got it locked up.
I'm with you.
But still, I agree with your take that they're probably going to play him most of the game at the very least, regardless. I was just curious your thoughts there, because I was trying to think through it as you're talking about the MVP race. I was like, I can't think of anybody else who's really competitive with him.
Yeah, I mean, I would assume, I'm not exactly sure how the UFL handles MVP. I would imagine it's, a league vote in some capacity, maybe media and, coaches, something like that. And I'm not really sure who else you could vote for. I guess someone could be a stickler and just say, look, Adrian Martinez has only played 5.5 games at this point. So I can't vote for a guy who's only played 5.5 games, especially if he were to rest week 9, week 10, which obviously we know he's not going to do. But yeah, I'm pretty much in line with you here. I think I'm going to come in a little overweight on Martinez. I mean, it just feels like, not quite a free square, but pretty close to it at
Yeah.
the quarterback position. I mean, it has been, at least for the last few weeks, he hasn't scored fewer than 28 DraftKings points in an individual start. He's averaging 4 more fantasy points per game than 2019 Lamar Jackson, who's the greatest professional football fantasy quarterback of all time. I mean, these are just absolutely ridiculous numbers that Adrian Martinez is putting up. And like, the tough part is that he's doing it both on the ground and through the air. He's had a game where he hit the 100-yard rushing bonus. He's had multiple games where he hit the 300-yard passing bonus. So I really think you can handle Martinez in a variety of ways. You can play him, on his own, play him naked. You can, I think the most popular way to play him will just be with a single stacking partner. To me, I'm okay with pretty much everybody that we've discussed routinely: Deion Kane, Marlon Williams, Jay Sternberger. Kevin Austin is pretty interesting. I don't necessarily think he's a particularly talented wide receiver, but his route share has been ticking up. It got up to 83% last week. So it feels to me like Birmingham sort of settled a bit on, Deion Kane, leaning towards Marlon Williams in the slot, and then Kevin Austin as the other outside wide receiver is sort of their starting trio. And maybe we see those guys play a bit more in the playoffs. But they've also just been a little weird with rotating these guys. So I don't want to sound, overly confident on Kevin Austin when, he could be out there for 80% of the routes and still get you a 0 or
Sure.
close to it. So yeah, Neil, I'm curious if you have any strong takes on these pass catchers, because for me, it's going to be mostly a mixing and matching. I might have a few double stacks, but probably mostly singles, maybe some Martinez just on his own.
Yeah, I'm probably going to be stacking him up just because he's so expensive. He's going to have to do some of his work. Or we did see him rush for 160 yards a few weeks back, so I guess he can get there mostly on the ground. But most likely to pay off this price tag, he's going to have to do some of the work through the air. So I think my biggest take is I'm probably going to be stacking him up in all of my Martinez lineups. But I'm with you on Sternberger. Like he's 6,000, 11%, 86% route share last week. Seems like a fine stacking option. Kane certainly is one of the better options. I like to call on Kevin Austin as we can't guarantee anything, but he's 5,100 coming in at 8% ownership. I kind of like that as you bring down the ownership of the stack, because Martinez is so chalky. You pair him with both, also the price. So you pair him with the cheap receiver who's also going to be low owned. I do kind of like the idea of just doing that stack. And then, Marlon Williams, 7,300, 11% ownership. We've seen him break out for some big games, so I think that's fair also.
Yep. And then this backfield, Ricky Person has pretty clearly claimed the RB1 role, like I predicted in week 2, week 3.
Yeah.
It was only a matter of time with how well he runs. It's just, it's a little tougher when CJ Maribel's in the backfield. We know he's going to command a little bit more work than a guy like Larry Roundtree will. Last week, Ricky Person had by far his best workload of the season, workload worth 20.2 fantasy points according to weighted opportunity. Of course, he didn't realize most of that, only scored 9.4 DraftKings points, but still pretty encouraging here. I'm envisioning something resembling a 60-40 split with a little, passing down work, maybe skewing a little bit more in favor of Maribel. I don't have a strong, take here. I think Person's a solid play. If you wanted to get a little weird, you could argue for Maribel. I don't think I'm going to go that route. Neil, any takes on Ricky Person or this backfield?
Yeah, I do like Ricky Person, so I'll say that. Here's one running back who I would play over De'Veon Smith, coming in at just 12% ownership. He is pretty expensive, but he's just in such a great offense, and he is a great running back. So I would bet on the talent on Ricky Person, pay up a little bit to play a little bit more Person. He's also in your non-Martinez lineups, of course, we've talked about before. He's just great leverage on Adrian Martinez. So just play some lineups where you're playing a different quarterback, play Ricky Person, hope that he gets a touchdown instead of Adrian Martinez. So, great leverage spot. So I do really like Ricky Person just as a talent, a leverage spot. I'll be overweight to the field on Person. Debating whether I would play, maybe if I maxed out the contest, I would play Maribel just as a, kind of same thing. And maybe they do split it more as they are gearing up for the playoffs in games that they don't really need to win. But I'm probably not getting there unless I'm maxing out the contest with Maribel. Muted.
Man, they got me. I think that's back-to-back weeks. That's tough. I was on such a good streak of not being muted, but I'm thirsty and I don't want my drinks to get caught up on the microphone. So that's the plight of the UFL Breakdown show host. But yeah, I'm pretty much in line with you. I think the best argument for Ricky Person is that I don't think a lot of people are going to end up there. He's basically the same price as Anthony McFarland, who we can get, really excited about now that we know John Lovett is out. We'll talk about him shortly. And yeah, I don't think a lot of people are going to end up on Person. So that's probably the best argument for him. We really haven't seen great upside from Person, and that's, Maribel mixes in around the goal line. Obviously Martinez can steal those reps, but like I've said for weeks or pretty much all season, he's a great talent, and getting 60% of this backfield is certainly worth a lot. Here, anything else to add on Birmingham before we move on to the San Antonio side?
No, I think we covered it pretty well.
Alrighty. San Antonio side, obviously we have Quentin Dormady as the starting quarterback. I believe I misspoke at the top of this game. It looks like Wade Phillips suggested that both quarterbacks will play. It's difficult to know what that split's going to be. I'm a little surprised that they'd rather go with a weirder, like, 2-quarterback system than just starting Garbers outright. That's a little confusing to me. So I'm curious on your take here. I wasn't going to play Dormady even if we knew he was going to play every snap. And I'm definitely not playing him if we think Garbers is going to rotate in at all. Not to mention there's just legitimate benching risk. If Dormady got off to a slow start, Garbers could play 3.5 quarters. So yeah, Neil, I'm kind of curious. What's your take on this quarterback situation? What's your read here? And then, yeah, what about the San Antonio pass catchers?
Yeah, Wade Phillips's quote was pretty vague. Just like he just said, I expect both of them to play. We'll see both of them in the game. Like, it was just didn't give us a ton to work with there. But if Chase Garbers is going to play even like a couple series, I feel like that's enough for me to, like, I don't want to play Quentin Dormady anyway. Just give me one more excuse to not play Quentin Dormady, particularly in this matchup. Birmingham, one of the best defenses in the league, certainly, giving up 265 yards per game over the past few weeks. They have given up 179 through the air, so kind of, middling in terms of passing yards given up. But yeah, I don't think that I'm going to be playing either of these quarterbacks. I clearly not playing Garbers because I don't think he's going to play that much, but I don't think that I'm going to play Dormady either. As far as the pass catchers, I think we can still go back to Jontre Kirkland. Like, he has not really done much. The ownership has come down so much, though, that I think you can go back there at 10,000, 7% ownership. I will probably be overweight to the field on Jontre Kirkland, make some take some shots there. We do have Justin Smith back this week. It looks like 4,900 for Justin Smith seems pretty good. I'm willing to pay that. I think I don't know. Cody Latimer has been he was good last week. Cody, should have had 2 touchdowns. That was pretty brutal that he lost the second one. It is such a tough matchup that I'm not as enthusiastic about playing my Brahmas as I usually am. But I do think, Cody Latimer has been just so involved in the offense that I think 7% ownership at 7,700 still worth playing. Debating whether I want to play Marquez Stevenson. He is 6,300, 1% ownership. It feels like every game there's like multiple times where shoots for Stevenson and it just goes over his head. Just like it feels like they try to get him the ball and they just, for whatever reason, can't seem to get Marquez Stevenson involved. So 1% ownership is probably fair on Marquez Stevenson. Maybe I'll play him if I play 10, 20 lineups, but probably not make it into my first lineup.
Yeah, I think Stevenson is the guy that I'm the most hesitant on. It looks like the field will be too. He's only projecting for 1% ownership. I've just gotten the sense that they want Landon Akers to work into the slot a little bit more. We saw that 2 weeks ago, and then Akers ended up getting hurt, missing what would have been week 8. And now he's back in the lineup. So, and, plus, like I've said for weeks, I think Stevenson's dealt with some kind of an unreported injury there. There's just been something weird going on with him where he hasn't looked quite as good and they haven't been force feeding him quite as much. So he's a guy that I'm a little hesitant on, but, you could just use that as the ultimate buy low signal and say, hey, he's going to be 1% owned. And we know, at least when healthy, he can look really, really good out there on the field. I think I'm going to lean more into these outside wide receivers, Justin Smith and Jontre Kirkland. Latimer obviously is fine. I do worry that, after back-to-back solid games from Latimer, we're going to get a little bit of steam on his ownership. Kirkland's just always due. He's so good and we know the targets will be there. So, there's that. And then you rewind 2-3 weeks, we were all talking about how Justin Smith was unlocked by Quentin Dormady. Justin Smith misses a week and now everyone's totally forgetting about him. I'm not necessarily sure if Justin Smith was unlocked by Quentin Dormady, but I'm always willing Yeah. But, and then he got bumped up to 6K and everyone was kind of done with it. Then he gets hurt. But now that he's back down to 4,900 at 3%, I mean, this feels like a pretty good spot to play Justin Smith. Again, at that price, he's a guy that only needs one long touchdown, which, he's obviously live for. So yeah, I think Justin Smith and Kirkland will be the guys that I lean into most, but you could really make an argument for any of these pass catchers here. All right, this backfield, Anthony McFarland could be looking at an absolutely monster role in this game. We have no John Lovett, and the team just doesn't seem very willing to give Morgan Ellison much work. My one fear here, I think this could go a few ways. They could split John Lovett's rushing workload. McFarland and Ellison could. Last week that amounted to about 11 carries, and I think 2 or 3 of those were in the red zone. So a split there would still lead to a pretty solid workload for Anthony McFarland. But what I think is, potentially the most likely situation here is that Anthony McFarland just ends up being a pure bell cow and Ellison only comes in, as a bit of a substitute. What I would worry about is Ellison still stealing those carries inside the 5, inside the 10. They haven't shown much confidence in McFarland as a short yardage back. I mean, at every opportunity when John Lovett was healthy, they were always getting Lovett in for goal line carries, for, 3rd and 1 type stuff. So, and, Ellison is just a better power back than McFarland is, as good as McFarland looked last week. So, that would be my concern, is that McFarland's touchdown equity may not be outstanding for a guy that we project for a bell cow role. But I mean, look, the month that John Lovett was a bell cow, he was averaging 21.9 weighted opportunities per game. That would be the second best workload in modern spring football history if he maintained it for a full season. So, some serious upside here for Anthony McFarland if he ends up getting, that old John Lovett role. Neil, what's your take on McFarland? I imagine he's going to be the most popular running back of the slate, but, again, we have a lot of decent running back plays, so I don't think ownership's going to get out of control.
Yeah, I mean, 30% ownership. So the upside there is the passing game work, to me, is what I love about Morgan Ellison. 5 targets last week. I know listening to Wade Phillips was like kind of bragging about, like, that was the first time a running back in the league has gotten over 100 yards rushing in a game. Like he took notice of Anthony McFarland going for over receiving yards in a game. Was excited about that. So I like it that the coach is wanting to have receiving work for his back. And I, as I've said before, like PPR points is just, it's so valuable in a low scoring league like the UFL. So I do like that about Anthony McFarland. He is also 8,900 in a really tough matchup with Birmingham. So I can't go crazy with it like I did last week with Sailors and Lovett last week, where it was just like, okay, these are guys with the best roles in the league in the best matchups possible. This week it's like, well, he's got a really bad matchup. He does have a great role. Like you said, I think that he's probably the bell cow. I think he's going to just take over the role, and he does have that receiving work. So we're hoping that he falls into the end zone, racks up 6 catches. There's certainly ways for him to get there, but there's also plenty of ways for him to fail at this price point in this matchup. So 30% ownership. I probably come in a little bit low. I think that I'd rather go to Ricky Person at 12% than Anthony McFarland at 30%. Personally, I'd probably split them, 20% each is probably more likely my approach.
Yeah, I think that certainly makes some sense. I just checked season-long weighted opportunity. The San Antonio backfield is just barely behind Birmingham as the most valuable backfield in UFL fantasy football. So, if McFarland can claim 70% of that, he's looking at a workload worth, 17 or so DraftKings points. That's really nice.
Yeah, we take that.
Yeah, but at the same time, I mean, I think you could argue, sort of the ball nowhere take might just be Birmingham obviously watched this film last week. They're probably going to play the flats a little harder than Arlington did, right, and really try to make sure that Anthony McFarland can't get out into space here. So yeah, the matchup's concerning. I think I'm with your take that, I might lean a little bit more into Person, but I'll probably end up matching the field or maybe going a little over on McFarland because, it's hard to fade these workloads where he could see 75%, 80% of snaps. He could get those inside the 5 looks too. I think that's less likely, but it could just be, what we saw with John Lovett from week 4 through week 7, where he was just an absolute monster.
True.
I don't think I have anything else on this game here. Do you have any other notes before we move on?
I just want to note that Morgan Ellison is 230 pounds. I don't know if you've heard that, Jake. They bring it up just like Antonio Gates being a basketball player, just like every single time he touches the ball. Morgan Ellison, 230 pounds. So yeah, I guess we have some goal line worry there, but I just wanted to note that he is 230 pounds because you can't mention Morgan Ellison without mentioning his weight.
Oh, of course. Well, it's like how Chris Hogan played lacrosse in college, right? Like there are certain players where it's just like there's one thing about him. The DC offensive coordinator, they love mentioning that he went blind in one eye for 5 days. They've said that like on like 3 different broadcasts. It's it's interesting the narratives that ESPN will and Fox will. They'll really cling on to some stuff. All right, moving on to our first Sunday game. Both Sunday games actually kick off at the exact same time. So both of these games will kick off at 2:30 p.m. Eastern time. That does add a bit of a wrench into some of your late swaps. So you have to get everything in before 2:30 p.m. Eastern. First game that we're going to talk about is the Michigan Panthers at the Houston Roughnecks here. I skipped one on the show sheet, but we'll come back to it, Neil. Don't worry. Michigan is a 4-point favorite. Total here is 40. 40 feels a little low. I kind of like the over. The spread feels about right to me. Any takes on this game line, Neil?
Yep, agreed on all counts. I think I would take the over as my favorite bet here. I don't think I would bet on either of these teams. The 4-point spread feels about right, but I think I agree with you on taking the over on 40 there.
Yep. All right. On the injury front for the Michigan side, Marcus Sims is dealing with a back and a hamstring issue. He hasn't practiced, but he also hasn't practiced all year, so I'm not very worried. Trey Quinn is dealing with a calf issue and was limited on Thursday, so that's worth monitoring when depth charts come out a little bit later this evening. The Houston side is clean, but it does look like Nolan Henderson will be the starter this week. Head coach Curtis Johnson said that assuming Henderson's healthy, and the injury report suggests that he is, he would like Henderson to start. We aren't sure if we're going to see a rotation between Henderson and Sinnett, or if Henderson will get a full game. So that's certainly interesting and is worth keeping in mind when we discuss Houston here shortly. But first, we'll start with the Michigan side. We aren't exactly sure what the quarterback situation is going to look like for Michigan. We could see a full game from Etling. We could see a full game from Bryce Perkins. We could see the rotation between Perkins and Lewerke. I don't really think that changes much for these pass catchers or these running backs, regardless of what the quarterback situation is. All these guys are pretty similar. I think Bryce Perkins is the best option overall. He's probably the best quarterback on their entire roster. I'd love to see him start in the playoffs, and maybe they'll come to their senses this week and do that. Either way, I'm not going to take any chances on these guys for DFS. I mean, maybe you could argue for Etling if he was listed as the starter. I think we could anticipate a full game there, but they might still want to see what they have in Perkins. So it could be an Etling Perkins rotation in that situation. Depth chart will help a lot with that. Wide receivers. Well, before we get into these wide receivers, I actually wanted to read off a great quote from Mike Nolan that's going to help us a lot with deciphering these, some of these Michigan starters, because I think a lot of people will want to dive in, especially to Matthew Colburn now that Wes Hills has been ruled out for the season. But here's what Mike Nolan said when he was asked about resting players. There's a couple reasons why you don't want to rest a player. Number one, they don't get paid, so you don't want to penalize them by resting. We could play them less and activate them, but we need numbers for the game to make it through the game. So that's the issue with it. You can't sit somebody down completely, but you can monitor them. That's probably what most teams will do. That's what we are trying to do, kinda. We are able to rest players, so that is what our intentions are. Some guys play a little less, and some guys play a little more. So it may be more of a 50-50 split rather than a 2-1 split, but nobody will be inactive because of our playoff positioning. That won't sit well with the players. I think that quote's really interesting because initially when I did my first run of projections, I was like, oh, Matthew Colburn is going to be mega bell cow. He's getting every carry. The problem is, I guess technically speaking, Michigan could still get home field advantage in the playoffs. If Birmingham drops the next 2 games, Michigan wins the next 2 games, and Michigan has a higher point differential than Birmingham. Right now, Birmingham has a plus 90 point differential. Michigan's is plus 38. So you could say that's already in the bag. The bigger problem is that, and I learned this recently, Ford Field is rented out for that weekend. They're doing a convention. So Michigan can't host the game there. They'd have to play at some other stadium in Detroit. So I'm not sure the game could take place there, even if Michigan did get the tiebreakers. To me, Michigan's more in a rest, sort of just, we want to be ready for Birmingham in round 1. We've kind of accepted that we're going to be the 2 seed no matter what. And that makes me want to back off of Marcus Sims a little bit. Granted, I'm not sure he was going to pull much ownership at all. And I really want to back off Matthew Colburn, who's going to be very, very popular. And, I think you could argue that that's justified. I mean, obviously with no Wes Hills, that makes a lot of sense. But what I said in my article, Colburn's the last starting caliber running back Michigan has. They need this guy for the playoffs. Nate McCrary and Toa Taua are not particularly great running backs. I mean, they haven't gotten basically any run all year. So, I mean, it's really tough. I think the depth chart's going to help. But, after I saw that quote from Nolan, after I thought about it a little bit more, I don't know if I'm really going to play any of these Michigan guys unless we see some more clarity provided by the depth chart. So, Neil, now that I've rambled for a few minutes, what are your thoughts on Michigan, Matthew Colburn, this team as a whole?
I mean, first of all, I'll just say that was excellent analysis, worth the price of admission right there. Man, really, really well done. Just getting great alpha and great analysis of that alpha, I would say. I'm not making a joke. Very, very serious point. I think that is awesome analysis. And
thank you. I really appreciate it.
Quote. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's
go. So my second thought there is, all right, so then do we need to consider a $4,000 Nate McCrary is kind of what I come back around to is like, well, we have all these other, like all of the running backs that we want to play are 9,000, like Devion Smith even is almost 8,000. So now we get Nate McCrary at half that price. If they are trying to save Matthew Colburn at all, do we Galaxy brain our way there? Maybe at 2% ownership. That's my primary thought there is maybe I need to be considering Nate McCrary. But outside of that, quarterbacks, probably not playing. I'm definitely not playing Brian Lewerke. You could make a case for Bryce Perkins if you think that they are just going to, play him a lot more than we're expecting, get him at 0 ownership. I don't think I'm going to go there because I'm not maxing out the contest. I don't think it's really necessary to go to either of these quarterbacks. Marcus Sims, man, you're just, this is a really tough spot to really want to play any of these guys. So I think it's also not a great matchup with Houston. There's just not, I'm not seeing a lot of reason to play the Michigan guys. What do you think? Are you playing any of these guys?
Yeah, I mean, I think I might just wholesale fade Colburn, which is pretty scary, given that. I mean, there's always the chance that they give Colburn half of the bell cow workload or something like that, and he could still get there in that sort of a situation. It is a tougher matchup though, so that's another reason you could get away from Colburn. Nate McCrary is a guy that I'm gonna play a little bit of. It's probably too Galaxy brain. I mean, my fear would be that, maybe they give 40 to 50% of backfield work to Colburn, and then they split the rest between Toa Taua and Nate McCrary. That would be pretty tough. I also think Toa Taua is the favorite for goal line work. He weighs 225 or 230. McCrary is a little bit lighter, a bit closer to Matthew Colburn in terms of like play style and overall size. So, that's tricky. At the same time, when a running back is 4,000, I mean, you really don't need much for him to get you there. It's tough though when, if this happened earlier in the season, I think we all would have been really excited to just wholesale punt running back and play a bunch of McCrary and then load up on these great wide receivers. It's a little tougher this week when we have pretty strong running back options overall. So I'm not sure if I'm going to end up with more than 2 lineups with a guy like Nate McCrary, but it's certainly interesting as a punt. And, there's also the scenario where maybe they just give Colburn a couple carries to open the game and then they completely pull him, and McCrary and Taua, split time for the vast majority of the game. So yeah, it's tough at wide receiver though. I really don't think I can touch these guys. I'm hopeful that the depth chart will provide more clarity. If something like say Marcus Sims was listed as a backup and Devin Gray was listed as a starter, well then all of a sudden I'm a little interested in Devin Gray. To me though, I think Michigan's kind of settled as on Sims, Trey Quinn, and COC Mariner as their favorite wide receivers here. So Quinn would probably be the most likely to lose some reps in the slot. Those could go to Devin Gray, maybe Devin Ross. I don't know. It's really tough. So I am hoping the depth chart could maybe bail us out a little bit here. But yeah, I don't think you want to take many shots on these Michigan guys when the passing offense just isn't worth much and there's just massive rotational risk.
Yeah, for sure. I keep coming. I'm debating so part of the appeal to me of Nate McCrary is that we only have 4 games. So I'm trying to think of what are the odds that just no other running back gets more than 12 fantasy points. Like these guys that are 9,000, if they only get like 12 fantasy points and you get 6 out of Nate McCrary, I think that I prefer him if I'm only playing one running back, like as the only running back in my lineup, just making the bet that every running back on this slate is going to fail. Like you said, it's not like it was early in the year where it was just like, we have no idea what's happening with running back. Like it's very likely that they're all going to fail, but I don't see any like can't miss running backs this week. Like we have, the guys who are, have good roles are really expensive and not in great matchups. And there's a lot of kind of like unknown situations. So it is like they're better options than we had a few weeks ago, but also I think that it's still like a little bit a lot of vague situations. So I'm kind of galaxy brain in my way to a little bit of Nate McCrary, but I don't want to make a point like it's like something that I love. Like I think it's just a jam it kind of spot. It's more of a galaxy brain. Like I don't honestly love any running backs on the slate. So that's kind of where I'm like, all right, well, maybe I'll make a bet that he's just going to play enough to pay off $4,000, have a couple receptions or something. But I again, that's totally a galaxy brain play. Don't think I'm playing a ton of this offense in general.
Yeah, I think it's tough too, because I'm not exactly in love with any of these high priced wide receivers. In previous weeks, I'd play a guy like McCrary and then I'd just say, oh, well, now I can afford Jontre Kirkland and Hakeem Butler or something like that. This week it's not nearly as tempting there. So,
yeah.
That is the tough part. I think McCrary feels great as a galaxy brain play, but I'm with you, Neil. It's not a guy that I really want to get too excited about, because there's, there's a lot of rotational risk, and, maybe he could earn 50% of the snaps and just be terrible. Perkins or Taua could steal these touchdowns, and, he probably won't win you a tournament if he only scores 4.5 DraftKings points or whatever. So that's tough. And the other note too, is the depth chart should tell us, I fully expect Michigan to keep 3 running backs active for this game. If somehow they don't, if for whatever reason it's just Colburn and McCrary, then it's much more wheels up for McCrary. That would be pretty exciting. But yeah, I would fully expect 3 running backs. So that it would be pretty surprising if they kept 2 here. I think we've pretty much covered everything for Michigan. Again, it's, depth chart should provide more clarity, but this is a really up in the air spot. We expect some rest for these guys over the next couple of weeks. Anything you wanted to add, Neil?
No, I think we covered it.
Great. All right. Moving on to the Houston Roughnecks side of the ball. It's a little exciting to get Nolan Henderson potentially starting a full game at 8,400. You could make a case for him. To me, it's kind of like when Manny Wilkins took over in place of AJ McCarron. I think the passing offense here could really take a hit. And that, I'm not fully going to fade guys like Justin Hall and Kiki Chisholm. I think Chisholm, especially at his price, is still very in play. We've really seen the targets be there for Chisholm over the last month or so. But I'm just not particularly excited about this passing offense. And, I'm really not that excited about the rushing offense either, in a pretty tough matchup against Michigan. So, Neil, I'm curious if you have any strong takes on this Houston offense, because I really don't feel any way in particular about them outside of being pretty cautious about this passing attack.
Yeah, I think I'm with you. My favorite is Kiki Chisholm, just because he is 6,200, 100% route share last week. But it's not a great matchup, not a great passing offense. So I'm still I think I'm probably going to be underweight to every piece of this passing offense. I don't think I'm playing anybody other than Justin Hall or Kiki Chisholm, most likely. And I think that I am probably going to be underweight to both of them anyway. So not a passing game that I'm going to be playing a ton of. In terms of the backfield, I don't know. TJ Pledger being 6,000 is interesting to me. 11 carries last week. Also, what was his involvement? He was a couple targets last week. He's generally considered more of the passing down back. Because he's 6,000, I don't love any running backs on this slate. Maybe I'll play a little bit of TJ Pledger. But honestly, it's not a great spot for these running backs. TJ Pledger, 2% ownership. Mark Thompson, 3%. Maybe I'll play a random share of these guys, but I don't think I'm going to be playing a ton of either. Do you see yourself getting to either of these guys?
I think I may play a little bit of Thompson. Pledger's just I just do not see any upside with Pledger when we know Thompson is going to steal a lot of these goal line carries. His workload, Pledger's workload was worth 9.4 fantasy points last week, according to weighted opportunity. 47% of snaps, 38% of routes, 47% of backfield weighted opportunity. So maybe you can make an argument there, but to me, all the backfield upside is locked in Mark Thompson. And maybe you could make an argument that if Michigan isn't going to take this game very seriously, if they're going to rest some starters, the spread, which is sitting at, Michigan -4, may not necessarily be correct. I mean, even if Michigan was playing mostly backups, it's probably closer to a pick 'em. But, in that scenario, Mark Thompson could absolutely get there. So I think this is kind of similar to like a Davion Smith spot where if I'm playing Mark Thompson, I'd like to play him a bit more with the Houston defense. To me, that's what makes the most sense, but I'm really not over the moon about Thompson. I mean, it's just, he's down to 7,900. So that's kind of nice, but it's just tough. Like we said, there's probably 5 running backs that are good plays, not great. Thompson's more okay-ish, but you're going to really save on ownership by playing a guy like that. 2, 3, 4% is where we expect him to come in. Anything to add there, Neil?
Yeah, I mean, the ownership is the reason that I hesitate, because I'm like, I don't really want to play either of these guys against a defense that over the past 3 weeks giving up just 70 rush yards per game, the best rush defense over the past 3 weeks. Really hard to get enthusiastic playing this team in general, just like the way they handle their running backs. Really hard to really want to play them, but the ownership, as you said, is kind of the one reason where it's like, maybe I need to consider it because I don't love any running backs and they are so, getting such low ownership. It's tough. To me, I think I lean more toward Pledger for the price and the passing game involvement. But I see your case with Mark Thompson being the goal line back too. I think ultimately I'm probably going to end up fading these guys and just using them as late swap options if like the first 2 games, don't go. And as you said, it's not the easiest late swap situation with these 2 games going off at the same time. But I think these are guys you can consider for your late swaps if you need to catch up points.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think late swap would probably be the best way to utilize these guys, but I'll have a few shares of Thompson. I mean, at the very least, it's a tradition with us, Neil. We got to lose money on Mark
true.
Thompson. Yeah, so
very true.
Gotta keep that alive, and eventually week 10 probably is when Mark Thompson will drop 35 DraftKings points and win everybody all the money. Maybe, hopefully, we will. We will see. Yeah, we will see about that. All right. I think we pretty much covered everything for this game. Really interesting game for fantasy. So glad I got that quote off because I think, the Michigan side could be quite interesting here. But our final game kicks off at the same time, Sunday at 2:30 Eastern time. It's the DC Defenders at the Memphis Showboats. DC favored by 5. Total here is 46. I want to bet the under here. The problem is that both of these defenses are just terrible. So that's my only hesitancy. Do you have any takes on the total or spread here, Neil?
Yeah, I don't think I can bet the under with these defenses being as bad as they are. It is really tough to take the under there. And I think the spread, honestly, I don't see a bet that I want to make here.
Yep. Yeah, I think this spot is probably a stay away from me as well. Total does feel just a little high, but it's tough when these defenses are awful. In terms of injuries, Briley Moore McKinney is back practicing. He could be active this week in place of maybe Caden Smith. That's worth monitoring for the Showdown bros out there. On the Memphis side, we still don't know who the starting quarterback will be. I'm not exaggerating when I say every single Memphis skill player is listed on the injury report in some capacity. They all practiced in full on Thursday, except for Case Cookes, who is limited. So we need to keep an eye out here. The depth chart will help. But QB, to me, is really the only thing that's up in the air. Memphis has sort of done this all year, where anyone who has, a bump or a bruise is listed as limited all week in practice, and then they end up playing and looking fine. All right, starting with the DC side, we've already talked about Manny Wilkins. We have talked about Adrian Martinez. The third quarterback who I expect to show up in most people's builds is Jordan Ta'amu, and it's largely because of this awesome matchup. We really haven't seen it much from Ta'amu this year, but this Memphis defense is terrible. By far, PFF's lowest graded coverage unit, a 39.6 PFF coverage grade for the Memphis Showboat secondary, also giving up by far the most passing yards per game, by far the most yards per attempt per game. So really just a perfect matchup for this DC passing attack. And, things have condensed a little bit now that Kelvin Harmon is out. Obviously, we know Ty Scott's going to be hyper popular at 6,700. He's sort of in that old Kelvin Harmon role. We have him projected for 44% ownership, which is pretty significant last week. And I wonder if this was a bit of a trend to deal with whatever St. Louis was doing defensively, but they actually ran a lot of 10 personnel. So a lot of formations where both Kiki Cutie and Chris Rowland were out on the field, 4 wide receiver stuff. I thought that was interesting. They both had a route share in the 60s. I believe that was the first time all year both players were over 50%. So maybe they'll keep doing some stuff like that. Also, I should note, there's a monster storm raging outside. So if I somehow drop off, Neil, you're gonna have to solo the rest of this show.
No,
but
Trey's gonna have to come on with me. Trey's
all
always
right
at the ready, I'm sure.
All right, yeah. Trey's ready. He knows. But to continue on with these DC pass catchers, both Chris Rowland and Kiki Cutie are really interesting to me as potential salary saving options in Jordan Teamu stacks, even as one-off plays. And then there's also Brandon Smith, who, led the team in both route share and target share last week. I don't think Brandon Smith is a particularly talented player. I don't think he's a guy they want to scheme a ton of targets for. But, I noted before week 8 that we weren't really sure what the split was going to be between Brandon Smith and Vincent Smith. Seems like DC has pretty firmly decided that they prefer Brandon Smith. Of course, no one would really be shocked if that flip-flopped in a given week. So Brandon Smith would be the guy I'm the most hesitant about. But Cutie and Rowland, I'm pretty excited for, if only because after last week's game, Michigan quarterback Brian Lewerke noted that Memphis was leaving the middle of the field wide open. And that was, what led all the Michigan quarterbacks noticed that. That was something they were talking about basically as soon as the game started. And, this Memphis defense has struggled all year. I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if they did that again. Chris Rowland and Cutie have dominated work over the middle. They both, Cutie at 19 and Chris Rowland at 18. They lead the team in middle of the field targets this season. So I think that's an encouraging note for both players. Chris Rowland could also pick up a little bit of rushing work. I suppose Cutie's live for that too, but probably more Rowland, who's always been a bit of a running back wide receiver hybrid. So now that I've given kind of that broad overview there, Neil, is this a bit of a mix and match situation, or do you have some clear preferences with who you want to play with Jordan Teamu?
Yeah, I think it is kind of a mix and match situation. I think this is a game to target. This is probably my favorite game on the slate. It's a game that could go a lot of different directions. Bad defenses, not the best offenses, but I'm in on Jordan Teamu, certainly going to be playing a good amount of Teamu. I think Brandon Smith does, just because of the price tag and ownership. I think he's probably like my favorite from an ownership standpoint because he's at 4,400, 13% ownership. I'm willing to take shots there after 8 targets last week, even if we don't really believe in the talent. Just the price tag doesn't take that much to pay it off. Great matchup. So I do like that. Ty Scott, from a pure projectable stand, like he stands out as he's probably the best receiver on the team. I like him at 6,700. I don't love the 44% ownership, but I'm not going to be like full fading him either. I really like this offense in general. I'm going to be playing a good amount of Ty Scott. My guess is I'll be underweight to 44% and take some shots on the lower owned guys, but I also don't think it's that crazy of ownership. Chris Rowland, 29% ownership, a little bit high, but again, 4,800, another cheap guy you can play. Kiki Cutie, I think I prefer Kiki Cutie just because he's also not that much more expensive, just 5,500, and we have him at 7% ownership, so just kind of like hoping that it breaks more in his favor as opposed to Rowland. But yeah, it's going to be mix and match, as you said. Just I'm not taking any huge stands on any of these guys. My guess is, going back to the old, probably a little bit underweight to the chalkiest guy in Ty Scott, probably a little bit overweight to the lesser owned guys in Kiki Cutie and Brandon Smith.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. You could also argue for either of these tight ends. I mean, maybe if they added Briley Moore McKinney to the player pool and he was 2,500 or something like that, that could be an interesting punt, considering we have seen Caden Smith play a decent bit. Alex Ellis obviously had a good game last weekend. He's only 4,100. I'm not really sure I want to chase that, but, just thought I'd throw those guys out there as, potential plays if you need someone that's going to be a little lower owned. I'm curious if you have a take on playing Rowland and Kiki Cutie in the same lineup. They're kind of cannibalizing the slot production from each other a little bit. But last week's usage was pretty encouraging. I have a hard time seeing them both get there. I think it's like a slight negative correlation, but not something to fully avoid. Curious on your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that you are correct. I'm trying to decide, like, I'm trying to recalibrate my brain for the size of these contests, because it's like, again, I usually play the 20,000 person contest in most sports. Now this one, I think it's 1,500 in this contest, so it's like you don't have to get that galaxy brain. So maybe my preference would be like, if you're playing one lineup, hand building Jordan Teamu, probably not taking both those guys. But if you're playing 20 lineups using an opto, I'm not going to set a rule against it. I think that you're right, that it's like, it's a little bit hard to see, but also, like you said, they played a lot of 10 personnel last week. They could both be out there, and even if they're splitting, if they're both 50% players, they could both theoretically get there. But yeah, I think it's something that I would mostly try to avoid.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I don't really think I have anything else to add here. Honestly, I like all these wide receivers a good bit. I think I'm going to come in a little underweight on Teamu, just because I do really like Adrian Martinez. And Teamu hasn't shown the upside, but man, the matchup is awfully good. In terms of the backfield, if you don't want a full punt running back with Nate McCrary, you can half punt it with Darius Higgins. It feels like we've done this dance like 3 different times this season, where I've been like, oh, this is the week. Darius Higgins is going to be a bell cow and he's cheap and we can play him. And it hasn't really materialized. I think it's finally starting to happen. Higgins started a game for the first time all season in week 8. He looked pretty good. He claimed 74% of backfield weighted opportunity. That only amounted to 4.3 DraftKings points, but in this matchup against a Memphis defense that's getting shredded on the ground, through the air by basically everybody, Higgins feels like a pretty solid play. The problem with Higgins, though, is that if this game gets out of hand, if Memphis got an early lead, I mean, he is total dust. He's not going to be catching many passes. We know DC is going to turn to their aerial attack. So, Neil, where do you land on Darius Higgins? Because, I mean, for the most part, it feels like things are pretty aligned, or lining up nicely, I should say, against a Memphis defense that's allowing 125.6 rushing yards per game and 4.4 yards per carry since week 4.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great spot. I'm going to be right there with the field. I think 22% going to Darius Higgins. Hard to really make an argument, other than I feel like this team's been jerking us around all year with the running backs. Like, every time we think that we know something, it's like, nope, he's not the guy. It's this other guy is who we want to go with instead. So I'm like a little bit hesitant from that standpoint, but I still think 22% ownership is pretty reasonable for a guy who is 5,800 in a great matchup, could be the bell cow. So I will take my shots on Darius Higgins. I will also note, like, if we, as far as like late swap goes, I mean, Cameron Harris might be the best late swap of all time. If you play Darius Higgins, you got that $100 left over, just swap it to Cameron Harris and you're going to have zero ownership. And honestly, would we be that shocked if Cameron Harris ends up splitting the work, getting even more than Darius Higgins? I wouldn't be that shocked. I think it's kind of they seem to play it by feel, who's running well this game pretty frequently. So honestly, I kind of like Cameron Harris as a contrarian play. I might take some shots there just, with my original lineups, but certainly love him as a pivot if you need to late swap onto somebody who is going to be unowned.
Man, I just don't think I can get there with Cameron Harris, but I definitely get it. I do think the team, they've had Harris and Higgins active for the vast majority of their games this year. They've still leaned towards Cameron Harris as the goal line back. So I think that's, sort of the overall argument you could make for Harris potentially just being an outright better play. And like you said, I mean, this backfield usage has just been all over the map. It's been very difficult to predict. I feel like I've come on this show probably 4 or 5 times this year and said, like, no, so-and-so's probably the guy. And then he's just not at all. So I certainly get the argument that Cameron Harris is an interesting late swap option. I mean, no one's going to go there. So that's generally the mark of a good late swap. Last week, friend of the show, Justin Freeman, almost took down the 10K to first in the main GPP with an Anthony McFarland late swap, which I thought was just
I didn't see that.
Incredible. Yeah, I was about to like DM him and be like, dude, this is the late swap of the century. But then he went from like 2nd to 7th on a last second play, and I was like, oh man, that's tough. I don't want to rub it in. Yeah, it's I should note Sam Pierce. The out tag on McCrary is incorrect. DK's been super late with updating players being out or probable or doubtful or whatever. So those tags don't really mean anything right now. They generally get everything updated before kick, but it seems like on Fridays, most of the time they'll have, players who we know are starting that they mark out. And at least from what I've seen, Neil, it really hasn't impacted ownership much, which, I mean, I think generally speaking in the past, something like that would significantly, but the UFL field seems to be pretty sharp.
I think it is sharper than your average field. People playing spring football DFS.
Yep. Yeah, that is very true. All right. So do you have any other notes on the DC side of this game before we talk about Memphis?
No, let's talk about Memphis.
All right. Quarterback here is still up in the air. It could be Troy Williams. It could be Case Cookus. I mean, geez, maybe we get a game from Josh Love. I don't know. Depth chart's going to help us a lot here. Regardless, I really don't think who the starting quarterback matters a ton for fantasy. Obviously, Troy Williams has proven to be the biggest boost possible for Dawood Davis. So that would be my one note, is that if Troy Williams ends up starting, Dawood Davis is going to come up in our projections by at least a point. Beyond that, though, I mean, I just don't think Josh Love is very good. So we can mostly focus on Memphis as if either Case Cookus or Troy Williams is starting. Because again, I think the debate remains largely the same. I don't have many strong takes here. Obviously, you could always go with Dawood Davis at 9,200. He is getting a little expensive, though. Sage Surratt, I keep, trying to make happen. 5,900 is a little tempting. Jonathan Adams at 6,100, I think, is especially nice as a bit of a buy low here. At the same time, though, I mean, pretty much everyone's being overshadowed by Dawood Davis. It was interesting to note that, D. Anderson has been playing well recently, and John DeFilippo said that they've been trying to work him in a little bit more. I kind of figured that would be more in the Jonathan Adams role, because I think, anyone who's been watching these games all year can tell Dawood Davis is the best receiver on the team. It seems like D. Anderson is mostly subbing in for Dawood Davis. So that's, maybe you could make a case for a guy like D. Anderson in Showdown. I don't think you're really getting there on the main slate. But Neil, I'll throw it over to you. I'm curious if you have any hard takes on these Memphis players. I mean, assuming it's either Troy Williams or Case Cookus under center, would you be willing to roll out either of those stacks? For me personally, I think if Troy Williams was starting, I might play a Troy Williams team or two. Cookus, I'm a little more on the fence about.
Yeah, now I came in here. This is not one of the games where or teams that I thought I might consider the quarterback. But I mean, what do you think the odds are that the starting quarterback just plays the whole game? Like, is it after they name a quarterback? Do you think they're probably going to be the starter?
Yeah, I think it's pretty high. I mean,
play the whole.
We've seen. It's hard for me to even count, but at least 3 times, and I think maybe 4 or 5, where the starter has just gotten hurt. So that's been a big part of these like weird quarterback rotations. Is, I mean, Cookus plays like he has a death wish. Like, he holds the ball in the pocket way too long and he doesn't slide. Like, I can't imagine. He has a wife, like, imagine watching your husband play when he plays like Case Cookus. That would be absolutely brutal. So certainly feel for Mrs. Cookus as she watches the Memphis Showboats games. But I think, assuming it's Troy Williams or Case Cookus, I think the chance that they start and finish the game is pretty high. Josh Love, I would be a little bit more iffy about, just because I don't think he's very good. So he would have the highest benching risk. But yeah, that's sort of where I fall on that.
Yeah, so I guess my take is, if it is Troy Williams, I'm actually going to like him quite a bit. I think doing the Troy Williams, Dawood Davis, just because of the matchup there. I think that I would be pretty into it. He's only 8,100. If he is named the starter, then I would be pretty into Troy Williams. Case Cookus, he's playable. 8,600. We have him at 3% ownership. If he's named the starter, I think that he is somebody that I would probably consider. If I play 10 lineups, I would probably have 1 Case Cookus lineups. If I play 10 lineups, I might have 2 Troy Williams lineups. So that's kind of, I will be overweight to whoever is named the starting quarterback, unless we get news that it's going to be split or something. But it is a great matchup with DC. So I think these quarterbacks coming in at virtually no ownership. I guess I should say DC only giving up 119 pass yards per game over the past 3 weeks. So I hadn't noticed the split is just they gave it all up on the ground recently. But I think that they are a bad enough defense in general that that might be a little bit of noise there. I think given how low the ownership is, once we get confirmation on who the starting quarterback is, if we can count on them for a full game at virtually no ownership, I do think it's worth taking some shots there. But again, preferably Troy Williams. Case Cookus more of a maybe 1 in 10, 1 in 20 kind of a guy. And then from a receiver standpoint, I'm with you. I love, like, Jonathan Adams would just be such a great play here. He's only 6,100, coming in at 1% ownership, 91% route share over the past 3 weeks. I believe it was 100% last week. This is where I want to go back to the Jonathan Adams well, even though he only does well when I don't play him. I'm going to take that shot. So you guys can avoid him if you want to. Dawood Davis, obviously 9,200, 12% ownership seems perfectly reasonable. Vinny Papali has become a full-time player over the past few weeks. You can certainly play him. He is up to 6,900, so it's not the best price tag in the world. But yeah, I actually like this offense as a, like, generally pretty low-owned offense, with the quarterback in particular being super low-owned. Sage Surratt playable, but only 54% route share over the past 3 weeks for. Wait, am I reading this right? Wait, where is? Oh, interesting. Yeah, so I believe I'm seeing only a 54% route share over the past 3 weeks for Sage Surratt. Last week it was
74%. He had a game
okay.
at 41, which I think caused the drop. Every other game he's been over 70.
Okay. All right. So I still think that he is still playable there. So yeah, it's really just those 4 receivers for me. But Jonathan Adams, my favorite at 1% ownership. Dawood Davis, the most projectable, really solid play, but he's 9,200 and going to be 12% owned. Papali ownership seems fine. Surratt ownership seems fine at 3%.
Yeah, I have a hard time saying I have a strong lean on any of these wide receivers, but I do. I mean, I came into the show not thinking I would end up playing a lineup with any of these, either Memphis quarterback, but I'm kind of with you. I think if they say it's Troy Williams, if they say it's Case Cook as starting, all of a sudden we have a situation where no one's going to really want to get off Teamu, Wilkins, Adrian Martinez for one of these guys. And, this could be a pretty juicy game in terms of overall fantasy potential. So I certainly see some upside there, but I think, if I play, say, 2 Troy Williams teams, I'll mostly be mixing and matching. But I do think, like I noted earlier, especially if it's Troy Williams, you'll really want to have Dawood Davis in there because he just has seemed to lock on to Dawood all year. I know I had a stat either last week or the week prior where over Troy Williams' last 3 starts, Dawood Davis has a 38% target share, which is just absolutely absurd. So keep that in mind if Troy Williams is the starter. If Cookus is the starter, I'll certainly be going with more of a mix and match approach. I don't think you need to force Dawood Davis in there. You already noted that DC, they're a pretty soft matchup through the air, but they're a really soft matchup on the ground. Darius Victor, his only problem is that he can't do anything on the ground. He really can't do anything at all. Only 7,200. He's still, it's like I said when we were talking about Davion Smith. He's one of those guys where 81% snap share last week, 94% of backfield weighted opportunities. These are generally numbers that just get us incredibly excited to play a guy in fantasy football. Darius Victor just hasn't turned it in to anything. His workload, according to weighted opportunity last week, was worth 15.3 fantasy points, only scored 7.7 DraftKings points. I mean, that's just been every week with him. At the same time, this is a spot where we could see, maybe Memphis gets an early lead. Maybe they can feed Darius Victor. The spread is 5 though. So that's tough. Neil, what do you think about Darius Victor here?
I prefer him over Devion Smith. So I will say that I think that I'm more and more inclined I'm probably just not playing Devion Smith at his ownership. I'd rather play Darius Victor at 15% ownership,
wow,
7,200 than Devion Smith. Because of the matchup and because of the ownership. Yeah, he has been pretty bad, but 33 carries over the past 3 weeks. Also pretty involved in the passing game, 56% route share over the past 3 weeks, 11 targets. So he's, not uninvolved at the very least. So given the matchup, given his opportunities, I will take some shots on Darius Victor, even though he has not done anything for me to this point in the season when I've played him. I think I'm willing to go back there even at 7,200 just because the ownership is low, the matchup is great, and I think the defenses in the UFL, like when you get a good matchup, you just see teams being able to take advantage of that. So yeah, I think I'm going back here to Darius Victor. I think that I would rather play Darius Victor than Devion Smith.
Yeah, this is a really tough one for me. I certainly see the argument for Victor over Smith. I mean, would you be shocked if both of these guys wound up at 18% ownership though? And then do you really have much of an edge with playing either guy? Yeah, because I do wonder, and I may make some adjustments after the show. I wonder how many people are going to see, oh, Darius Victor's 14%, Davion Smith projecting for 27% or whatever we said he was at. I'm just going to play a little more Victor, a little less Smith. Then all of a sudden, both these guys are pretty similar in terms of projected ownership. To me, I think I'm obviously not going the Matt Colburn route, but I think Victor would be a pretty interesting swap off of a guy like Matthew Colburn. At the same time, though, I mean, do you really want to late swap to a guy who's still going to be 15% owned, probably on the low end, could get to 20? It's tough. It's a really tough spot.
It is a tough thing to really want to play a ton of it, but yeah, I'm in. I'm gonna be taking my shots here. I've convinced myself the ownership is low enough, the price is reasonable enough, and the opportunities are there. Even though he hasn't really been great, I think that this is just such a great matchup. Like, it can't be overstated how great this matchup is, with a team giving up 174 rush yards per game over the past 3 weeks. Like, that is just insane.
Yeah, that is true. This would probably be a difficult stat poll, but I do wonder how many of those rushing yards have come on like big chunk plays, which we know Victor just really isn't capable of, given that he's 5'9", 230 pounds. Yeah. I mean, he's just an absolute unit. So you're not going to get those big runs from Victor like you will from a lot of other running backs in the UFL, but he could certainly grind his way there. And, a big part of his problem this season has been that he's just not, going into the season, we anticipated Memphis is going to run a ton of plays. They're probably going to score a lot of points. He's going to get all the carries inside the 5. That's worth, so much. There have just been no carries inside the 5. I mean, no team has run worse in terms of rushing inside the 5 than Memphis, largely because they aren't getting in position to do it. And they haven't been calling those plays for the most part when they get there. So it's tough with Victor. I think I'm going to be underweight. Maybe I'll just full fade him. I mean, full fading Victor hasn't failed me yet this season. So, but I certainly understand the argument for it. Neil, did you have anything else on this game here?
Let's see. No, we went over. Yeah, no, I think we covered it pretty well.
I think we did. I also think we did a pretty good job talking about late swap options. Obviously, a guy like Cameron Harris, a little bit interesting if you want to get off of Darius Higgins, which I think that's a fair call. Do any of these other late swaps stand out to you? I think you could maybe argue, again, we'll get more clarity when we get the depth chart. You could maybe argue for some of these ancillary Michigan guys, like a guy like Devin Gray or Samson Nakua, as like a real punt in terms of late swap. If we think, maybe Marcus Sims gets some rest, maybe COC Mariner gets some rest. That feels a little bit more thin to me. I think I'd rather lean into, like these Memphis wide receivers, swap off DC for more Memphis guys, something like that.
Yeah, I like Jonathan Adams for my original lineups, but at 1% ownership, I also love him for late swap. Now, wouldn't be shocked if he comes in higher owned than that, because he looks obvious. Like, you and I both saw it like right away, like, oh yeah, that's what I want to play. 1% owned Jonathan Adams. So maybe the rest of the field sees it too, and he comes in at 5%. But even there, that's nothing too crazy. So yeah, I think I'd rather go to Jonathan Adams, Cameron Harris, than those random receivers for Michigan.
Yeah, I'm with you. If I'm getting weird with anyone on Michigan, it's probably going to be Nate McCrary. But of course, I mean, if Samson Nakua was listed as a starter and Sims as a backup, that would be something that would certainly change things this week. All right, well, I think that just about does it for our show this week. Neil, why don't you tell all the great people about what you have going on with your YouTube channel and the great content you've been putting out?
Yeah, you can find me on YouTube. It is I just changed the name of my channel to the Flannelverse. You can find links to it on my Twitter, but I do best ball content 3 to 4 days per week. Also have a podcast where I interview some of the best DFS players in the world. Just had a 2.5 hour long podcast last night with Nerdy Tenor, which he's super interested in hearing what he has planned for the Endgame Syndicate, his new venture. Really, really fun interview. So go, if you have some time, go check out that interview with Nerdy Tenor. But yeah, you can find me on Twitter at PlayerQDFS, and right here on Fridays.
Yep, that's awesome, man. I'm really excited to listen to that interview with Nerdy Tenor. You interviewed him for High Stakes, right, back in the day?
I did.
Yeah. Really, really liked that interview. It helped me understand that many of the guys I'm competing against are part machine.
Yeah, exactly. They're way smarter than us, Jake. We are dogs here.
Yeah, we really are. Before we get out of here, Neil, I need to know, what percentage of your wardrobe is flannel?
So mostly in the summer, I wear V-necks, just like cotton V-neck, one color t-shirts. But my winter wardrobe, I would say it's 90% flannel, 90% flannel in the winter. And then in the summer, I usually switch to non-flannel. This is actually a t-shirt here. So I do have flannel appearing. This is not actually flannel material, but just things that look flannel that I wear in the summer.
Wow. That's incredible. What does your wife think of the flannel?
She likes it. I live in Minnesota, so it doesn't stand out as much.
That's true.
People always commented on when I'm on stream, but like in Minnesota, pretty common to wear flannel. She wears a good amount of flannel also. So
nice.
Yeah, I don't really stand out here.
Yeah, I think that's great. I was laughing at Trey's comment that he'll be underweight the field at 90% flannel. I think that's pretty great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you guys can certainly catch me in the flannel verse too. I'll need Neil to grade some of my best ball drafts. I'm about to dip into DraftKings a little bit. Got some tickets, and I know they have some good rake back offers for May. So I'll have a few drafts for you to grade, Neil, and I'm hoping to get at least.
I didn't even mention the Discord, by the way. Yeah, I also did start the Flannelverse Discord as well on top of the YouTube channel, which you can also find on my Twitter.
That's awesome. Yeah, definitely go check out all of Neil's stuff. Alrighty, guys, that does it for the Week 9 edition of the Fantasy Points UFL Breakdown. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope to see you all at the top of the leaderboards. What?
Why are you shaking your head?
You're welcome.